One of the strangest shifts in a business happens the first time you realize the money inside it isn't urgently needed anymore. For a long time, every dollar that enters the business has a job waiting for it. Revenue comes in and immediately flows somewhere else: expenses, contractors, reinvestment, marketing, keeping the system moving. There's never really a pause. But eventually, if the system survives long enough, something changes. The business produces more cash than it immediately needs to keep operating. And when that happens, the way you think about money inside the system has to change too. When a business begins generating surplus cash, you stop managing income and start managing capital. That transition is subtle at first. I remember noticing it during a stretch when the business had become more predictable than it had ever been. Revenue wasn't exploding, but it was steady enough that the system could comfortably cover its own operation. Month after month, the machine kept producing. At first, that stability simply felt like relief. But after a while, something else started appearing: unused cash inside the business. Not a huge amount, just enough that every dollar coming in didn't already have a destination waiting for it. That was new. For years, the business had trained me to treat money like oxygen. It arrived, and it needed to be used immediately to keep the machine alive. Speed mattered. Movement mattered. Every dollar had to do something. But capital behaves differently than survival income. Capital introduces patience into the system. Revenue is reactive. It follows the work the business already knows how to do. Capital is strategic. It shapes what the business can become next. That distinction took me longer than I expected to fully understand. In the early years of building something, the instinct is to deploy money quickly. If the business earns more, you expand something. You increase marketing. You hire help. You invest in growth. Speed feels like progress. But once a business begins producing consistent surplus cash, that instinct can quietly work against you. Because capital isn't always supposed to move immediately. I remember a period when the business was holding more liquidity than it ever had before. It wasn't a massive amount, but it was enough that the system could operate comfortably, even if new revenue slowed down temporarily. That buffer alone changed how decisions felt. The business stopped reacting to every small fluctuation in income. There was room to observe, room to think, and that space created something unexpected: clarity. Capital changes the pace of decision-making inside a business. When every dollar is needed immediately, decisions tend to be fast and tactical. The goal is simply to keep the machine moving forward. But when the business has capital, the question shifts. Instead of asking what the money should do right now, you start asking what the money could allow the system to do later. That difference might sound small, but it completely changes how the business evolves. I began noticing that the founders who built the most durable systems weren't necessarily the ones who generated the most revenue the fastest. They were the ones who treated surplus cash with unusual discipline. They let it sit. They protected it. They waited for opportunities that actually strengthened the architecture of the business rather than just expanding activity. That kind of restraint feels unnatural at first. Entrepreneurs are used to motion, growth, deployment. Holding capital requires the opposite instinct. The first discipline of capital isn't growth, it's restraint. That realization forced me to rethink how I evaluated expansion opportunities. In earlier stages of the business, almost any growth opportunity looked appealing. If it increased revenue, it felt like progress. But once capital entered the picture, the question changed. Would this decision make the system stronger? Or would it simply make the system larger? Those two outcomes aren't always the same. Some forms of growth create leverage. Others quietly increase complexity without improving the underlying structure of the business. Capital gives you the ability to see that difference more clearly. When a business is operating under constant financial pressure, it often has to accept whatever growth appears. There isn't enough room to be selective. But once the system has capital, selectivity becomes possible. I remember noticing how differently certain decisions felt once that buffer existed. Opportunities that once would have been automatic yeses became slower evaluations. Not because they were bad opportunities, but because the business no longer needed them to survive. Capital gives a business the power to choose its growth instead of chasing it. That shift is where strategy truly begins. Early-stage entrepreneurship is about generating income. You prove the system works. You create motion. You build the machine. But later, when the machine produces surplus cash, the role of the founder changes again. Now the work becomes allocation. Where should this capital go? Should it reinforce the current system? Should it acquire something new? Should it remain untouched until the right opportunity appears? Those decisions don't usually produce dramatic short-term changes. In fact, they often feel quiet compared to the excitement of early growth. But over time, they shape the trajectory of the business far more than most people realize. Because capital doesn't just fund expansion, it determines the direction of the system. I remember realizing that some of the strongest businesses I admired weren't simply generating impressive revenue numbers. They were quietly accumulating capital and deploying it carefully. That patience allowed them to move decisively when opportunities appeared. Acquisitions, strategic shifts, investments that strengthen the structure of the business itself. Those moments rarely arrive on a predictable schedule. They appear suddenly, and the businesses that can act on them are usually the ones that prepared long before the opportunity existed. The real power of capital is that it gives the system time and control at the same moment. Time to evaluate decisions. Control over how the business evolves. Once you experience that shift, the way you think about cash inside the system changes permanently. Money stops being something that simply keeps the machine alive. It becomes something that shapes what the machine can eventually become. And that's when the business enters a very different phase of maturity. Not just producing income, but quietly accumulating the strategic weight that turns a working system into a durable one.